Good morning, everyone. Thanks you for joining us today. I would just like to go over a couple housekeeping tips before we begin. You are currently muted when you come into the meeting, and so please stay muted. We will have a chance for you to speak. We will have questions and comments available after the end of each section, so you can unmute and then talk then. But until that time, please stay muted. You can also send your comments to the chat box. Those will come to me, the host, and then I will share those with our speakers. And so if you have any questions, like I said, just send them through the chat box, and we're glad you're here joining us today. I'm going to turn it over now to our FLC Ambassador, Shwanda Barnett.
Good morning. Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel said, my name is Shwanda Barnett, and this morning I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Scott Paine, and we are honored to be here today and really looking forward to hearing from our guests on how they persevered through very difficult circumstances in their capacity as mayors. I believe we all will take away many gems from the conversation today. So without further ado, Mayor Hill, our president, would you like to welcome our guests, our audience, and set the tone for today's Candid Conversations?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shawanda. We're just excited for an opportunity to have our second Candid conversation with mayors. As you guys are aware, we will continue to have a series of conversations where we talk about mayors' roles in healing our communities. Today, we've got a great panel in store for you, and we are just excited about the conversations that we're about to have. So we encourage everyone to join in at the end as we get through each section, and provide your input and your questions so that we can have a very meaningful conversation as it relates to mayors and their roles in healing the community.
Thank you, Mayor Hill. We're going to start with the first of our guests, Mayor Tracy Upchurch from the city of St. Augustine. Good morning, Mayor, and thank you for agreeing to be a part of this Candid conversation.
And thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's start with we're actually going to talk to you about a couple different things that you've faced as mayor of St. Augustine, but we want to start with the first part, talking about something that many of our cities and counties have faced here in Florida and around the country. This has been a conversation going on now for a few years. In fact, I was just reading a headline this morning about a related topic having to do with military bases. This is the Confederate War Memorial conversation. And if you could, Mayor Upchurch, start by letting us know a little bit about when did this first become controversial, at least in recent memory, and how was that initial public debate? How did that unfold?
First of all, our monument is the second oldest in the state of Florida. So it was erected about 1870. So it really predates what we more traditionally refer to as the Jim Crow monuments. So it's sat in our plaza since for 140 some odd years. It became a controversy. It became controversial after the events in Charlottesville. I was not on the commission at that time, and so that commission took a great deal of public comment, and ultimately what they decided to do was to contextualize the monument, to place plaques at the base of it, 4 of them, that would help the public understand the meaning, the interpretation, and how the meaning and interpretation has changed over time. We were fortunate. We had a very distinguished local committee, a diverse group, 2 or 3 history professors, etc. So we had a nice group of folks that worked very, very diligently in the public to come up with the text for those 4 plaques. They were installed. It was in many ways a perfect solution that pleased nobody. If I had been on the commission, I think I absolutely would have voted for it. It made sense at the time to me, as I observed it just as a private citizen. But those that were supportive of the monument wanted to leave it pristine and unadorned and in its natural historic state were not pleased, and those that wanted the monument removed were not pleased because the monument still stayed almost identically to how it had existed. And so that was the posture we were in with Michael Floyd's murder in May of this year, when the demands for removal, relocation of the monument came up again.
So that event, the death of George Floyd, and the national response to that, then played out locally in St. Augustine, and all of a sudden, with all this decision work that had gone, all the committee work, it really changed the conversation, right? What was that change, and what did that look like?
Well, and the state of Mississippi finally changed their flag.
Right.
Putnam County voted to relocate their monument. Mayor Curry in Jacksonville took his down in the dead of night. So this is a reckoning that has occurred across our state, certainly across the South and elsewhere, where because of the visceral nature, and candidly, from my perspective, I think the event in Brunswick is every bit as chilling, which of course just occurred a few months before. So I think George Floyd's death has caused the entire nation, but certainly our community, to revisit these issues with a new perspective. And I think obviously we've seen that across the country.
So what did that conversation look like? Did it change the sentiment in the community? Did it change the will of now a new council in which you're serving on this board now? Did it change what the community decided was best, and how did you get to that point? So
we really made our decision almost within a month of George Floyd's death by June 22nd. We already had one commissioner that had called publicly to revisit the contextualization, to revisit the monument. I then made it clear publicly that I was willing to have that conversation, and so that set the table. We probably had, and this is 5 or 6 public protests of one nature or another during that month. Wide community support for a relocation, for removal. The actual day we had a special meeting. The meeting went for 10 hours. We had countless public speakers. This, of course, was a COVID meeting.
Right.
We had 300 email, which we read for 3 minutes each. And then we had an open telephone line. So we took probably 8 hours of public comment, and then the commission deliberated for about an hour. It turned out to be a 3-2 vote to relocate. But I should also add that the 2 commissioners that did not vote to relocate it still wanted to change the message of the monument. So one way of looking at it is to say that there were no votes on the commission to keep the monument as is. 3 of us wanted to relocate, 2 wanted to broaden its message, broaden its interpretation to a veterans monument, a Civil War monument to recognize Union dead as well as Confederate dead. So, but we then, in fairness, had a tremendous backlash. So we've had 25, by last count, 25 protests of one nature or another from George Floyd's death to probably the middle of October. And so it has been a challenge for our community, and one that we're continuing to address in some form or fashion.
Well, I ask you to step back from the specifics of this and think about, this is a group of mayors for this conversation. How did you think about your role as mayor in confronting this specific controversy? How did you see your place in the community and the dialogue?
Well, I was born and raised in St. Augustine. My father had been mayor, my grandfather had been mayor. And so our roots are deep in the community. But I made a very conscious decision to get out front on this issue and to publicly state where I was going. And so I made it clear that I supported the relocation of the monument prior to the meeting. Now, I received some criticism for that, but that was the decision I made. And really looking at it from kind of a 6,000-foot level, I felt like I had social and political capital that I was willing to expend on this issue. I felt like it was important enough, and I felt like I was in a unique position because of my long roots in the community, that I could successfully take the lead on the issue. And that was a very calculated decision. I don't know that this is helpful, and I don't know that it's a completely accurate historical interpretation, but as I think most of you know, our community was rocked by civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s. And at least as I think back and I read about that period of time, I think in large measure the local leadership was paralyzed, and we almost were like the citizens of Gettysburg. All of a sudden there's a battle in our community and we didn't know what to do in the 1960s. And so we had segregationists that came, and we had civil rights leaders that came, and they used our community as this battlefield. And my sense is the local leadership was paralyzed, and I did not want to repeat what I think was a mistake. And so I personally was proactive. As I indicated, one of our other commissioners had already stated her intention, and our city manager has been deeply involved. He was deeply involved in the contextualization, and so he provided wonderful leadership in many, many different ways to move us through this. For all the protests, everybody's constitutional rights were protected. We had no property damage. We had no personal injury. We had 3 arrests, and 1 gentleman was arrested twice. So 2 individual, 3 arrests. So as difficult as it was for the commission, for the community, for city staff, particularly our police department, we got through it beautifully.
And I don't want to minimize how difficult that was. We may want to come back to making sure people understand the pressures that all of you were under and the way that played out. Many of us may have had similar experiences or can easily imagine how disgruntled members of the public on both sides of an issue like this can get very upset. But one of the things you said to me when we talked about this earlier was that you thought that the city of St. Augustine coming into this controversy had something of an advantage. And you talked about, obviously, as you've suggested, you felt that leadership was important and you took that leadership position. You facilitated community participation in dealing with all this. But before all of that, I had the sense from talking to you that you felt like the ground had been well laid as the city of St. Augustine in dealing with all of its residents to be able to handle a controversy like this. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that, because and again, this is something I take no credit for, because this ground was laid, this foundation was laid prior to my coming back to the commission. We have an excellent police department. And so issues about strangulation holds, unequal policing, one of the very first protests we had, one of the leaders of the protest singled out our police chief and basically said how fortunate we are to have him in his leadership. So we have an excellent police department that did not have issues with police brutality or any of those related issues. We had community groups, diverse, multiracial community groups that had been meeting for years in an effort to think about and to address issues of equality in our community. These are not city committees, but they were community committees of which city employees and some commissioners participated in. So we had lines of communication that existed. And frankly, I think our community as a whole deserves a great deal of many accolades for how they handled it. It was frightening. And of course, many people came into our community, certainly from the county, came into the city, but from surrounding counties as well. But they, by and large, conducted themselves well. And so all of those things, I think, contributed. One other thing that I would say that I think is very specifically directed at mayors and commissioners is we worked really hard to be transparent. And so we kept the public informed about where we are. It took us forever to get this monument moved. It was really complicated. And so in the middle of our city, we had a construction site. And so that gave people a wonderful place to protest and to focus their anger and their angst. So we did these things in public meetings. We did these things after public input. We were very clear about the cost, and it was expensive. And so there weren't any gotcha moments. And I think that helped a great deal, particularly when we live in an environment where we have so much distrust. And so trying to do these things in public meetings in a transparent way after public input, I think was also very important.
A couple quick questions before we turn to your colleagues and see if there are questions from our audience. Anyone who's looked at this issue knows that there's a challenge. You have this monument. People don't generally feel comfortable with destroying it. So, did the monument end up in a museum somewhere? What actually happened to the monument?
As you can imagine, there's not a big market for old Confederate monuments. There's a lot of them on the market right now and not a lot of demand for them. We were very, very, very fortunate because we had a prominent businessman in our community step forward. He was opposed to the move, but he had a beautiful piece of property, private property, that is accessible by the public, and he offered the site. He paid for the foundation. And so, number one, it gave us a place to deliver the monument. If we had not had that, it would have been in storage. We would have been accused of not wanting to relocate it. We would have had to constantly revisit the issue. When are you going to move it? Where's it going to go? All of that issue. And we would have had to pay additional costs to remobilize the mover. And so it was a tremendous blessing to our community that Mr. Ringhaver and his company Ring Power stepped forward and said, we will accept it. It still belongs to the city. We have an artifact loan agreement. But he has made a wonderful home for it that just checked all of the boxes.
Well, then, of course, you have in the public square here in the center of the city, you have this space that used to be dominated by this large monument. So what have you done with that space?
We've planted grass, and it's really nice grass, and we are really, really grateful for it. Just Tracy talking, I have no energy for any conversation about what goes in its place. As you start thinking about that, and it's been such a difficult conversation to make the decision we made. There's no compelling need. If you have not been to St. Augustine, the chances are you would drive by and not notice anything. It's been beautifully landscaped. There's a Christmas tree in the space right now. So I don't anticipate any effort, conversation about a replacement. Will that come up in the future? Sure. But it is certainly not on my agenda, and I don't think anybody else's agenda right now.
So let me turn, thank you, Mayor. Let me turn to Rachel. See, do we have questions from our audience for Mayor Upchurch?
We don't have any questions in the chat box right now.
Okay. Well, so Mayor Upchurch, don't go away. We'll be back to talk with you again because St. Augustine has also faced its challenges of a more natural nature at this point. Let's turn now to former mayor and now state representative Hunschofsky from Parkland. And first, if I may, Representative, I just wanted to thank you. I've had the privilege of talking with you on more than one occasion about the tragedy that took place in your city and about the challenges of leadership through that environment. I'm grateful that you're willing to share that here with this group. I'm also grateful for the opportunity I had to speak with you before this because I was doing a program earlier this week for the National League of Cities about crisis leadership, and coming out of my conversation with you, I stole a number of your lines. It was just without any apology. You had so much to say about how one thinks about, especially communicating with the public. So I want to thank you for the insights you provided me and the inspiration for that talk. And I'll turn this over to Shwanda, who's going to talk with you about your experiences.
Thank you, Scott. So I think in the case of Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting, probably everyone in our audience today is familiar with at least the broad outlines of that event and what happened on that day. But with your permission, Representative Hunschofsky, I'd like to ask you to focus on how you, as the mayor of Parkland at the time, were drawn into these events.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity as mayors. There is always so much we can learn from each other, and I'm happy to share the story. Listen, I think sometimes people forget as mayors, we are also human beings. So for me, the Marjory Stoneman Douglas is literally diagonally across the street from the subdivision that I live in. And many of my friends work there, and friends have students there. So I remember getting the call a little after 2:20 or so about a potential shooting over there. And I immediately went to the corner to be there for the chance that the parents would be showing up. And it was very difficult because on the one hand, I have my mayor's hat where I know it's my responsibility to keep the public calm and informed with good information. And on the other hand, I am a mother. And what was going on at Marjory Stoneman Douglas was my worst nightmare, as it would be any parent's worst nightmare. I actually remember as the students were coming out, several of them I knew, and one of them was the daughter of a very close friend of mine. I remember being so overjoyed to have seen her emerging from the school that I gave her a huge hug and texted her mom that I saw her and she was okay. So, and I bring that up because I think it's important that in our roles as mayors, we also acknowledge that there is a human side to us as well, and that can be challenging at times. As mayor, though, it was important to me that I be on hand for the community, that they saw that I was there. If I did not have all the answers, when at the beginning it was very chaotic and there weren't many answers, that I was at least giving residents the best information I had at the time and remaining calm the whole time. Mm-hmm. And also always communicating that we would get through this together somehow.
Absolutely. I know there have been a lot of fingers pointed in a lot of directions about the event itself and the aftermath. It seems that one of your biggest disappointments and sources of difficulty beyond the tragedy itself was intergovernmental. Can you just share with us the nature of the problem?
Oh, it was quite an interesting experience, to say the least. As a small city, we were not always brought into the conversations that were happening afterwards. Our communications officer was often getting updates on Twitter as opposed to from the agencies that were responding. Wow. And as in any kind of a mass event like this that all of a sudden garners a lot of media attention, there was a lot of focus from many individuals of making sure they were the ones appearing on camera, as opposed to maybe communicating with those of us closest to the ground. In fact, we were not told directly who the victims were and had to find that out often through newspapers because we were not being communicated with. And the way that I circumvented the lack of a formal process of communicating was by just showing up everywhere. I went to, I think, every meeting possible that I could have under the time constraints that I had, because every time I showed up at a meeting, I would be given information that normally I probably would not have had access to. And just being out in the community, speaking with people so that I could get information that way. It was not a very effective way of communicating, but given the situation we were in, it was something necessary in order to get the communication. Because if I had just been sitting waiting for the communication to have been given to us, I would probably still be waiting for much of that information.
In your conversation with Scott, in addition to that frustration, you also identified what I found to be a surprising degree of, might I say, unhealthy competition arising out of the tragedy. Part of this was about the information and who had it, which you just spoke to, but another part of it was about people's grief. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so listen, in a mass tragedy, it is a trauma that is experienced by so many people, whether you were in the building, not in the building, nearby. And everybody deals with trauma in an individual way. So even though it was a mass event, every person is coming with their own previous trauma, their own previous life experience, and therefore experiencing this event in a very individual basis. And that led to different reactions. There was competition about who suffered more, who should be given more information, why was this person given more information than that person, whose trauma, who experienced the most trauma. And this is all actually very common to be happening after a mass tragedy. I was very fortunate. So this happened at 2:21 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. And on Friday morning at about 4:30 in the morning, I was getting ready for an interview on television. And I am forever grateful for that interview because that is where I met Nicole Hockley. Nicole Hockley's son, Dylan, was killed at Sandy Hook. And at 4:30 a.m. on that Friday morning, I was able to get advice from her of what to expect. And it included, I remember her specifically saying, in the beginning, it will seem like everybody will come together and then this tsunami will hit your city where people will be divided on everything, on positions on things, of who's getting more information. And she literally, everything she said is exactly what happened in our community. And because of that conversation with her, I, mainly because of that conversation from her, I very early on decided I was staying out of any topics that were inherently dividing, because while elected officials on all different levels of government could worry about different policies, those of us on the municipal level, I felt our number one duty and responsibility was to try and hold our community together and to focus on the healing process and to make sure that our community had its needs met from a resilience standpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. So no one wants to go through what you went through in Parkland. And even what you personally went through, we were all looking from the outside in, but we can't even imagine what it was like being on the ground. But at the same time, and I think it's evident in everything we'll talk about today, there's this need to acknowledge that a tragedy like this can strike any city at any time. What is your advice to your colleagues here today about how to prepare and how to survive?
Yeah, so we weren't prepared, and I think in many cities, people aren't prepared, especially smaller cities. We're a smaller city. One would not expect something like this. I would literally work with your first responders, work with your city managers, work with your communications department to start setting up some plans. If there were some kind of a mass emergency in different sections of your city, where would people go for relocation? That was one of the situations we ended up with. And the relocation ended up being at a Marriott hotel nearby. The unfortunate thing about that was that the walls were so thin that you could literally hear the screams from the parents as they were being given the news. So it's very important to have kind of mapped out ahead of time, should a mass event occur in different areas of your city, where would the relocation be? Who is the point person for communication? Does that point person for communication have established relationships with those who are providing the emergency response, with, if it's through the schools, with the people at the schools, and the different entities that could be affected by it? And what kind of relationships do they have with them? It's important to build up all those relationships ahead of time in the hope of having a more coordinated response should something, God forbid, happen. Having said that, no matter how much preparation you do, it's a mass event, and chaos is something to expect. And I think the important thing when dealing with chaos is to take a breath, remember your purpose, and remember that people are looking to you for some kind of reassurance that you can get through this. And while I may not have always believed it when I said it, I made sure that our community knew that we were strong, that we were capable, and that we would one way or another figure out how to get through this, because that is who we are. And I wanted to remind our community that that is who we are.
Yeah, you shared a lot of leadership lessons just in this brief time that we've been talking. But what would you say was like the greatest leadership lesson that you took away from this experience that will follow you throughout your political career?
The two things I would say is people sometimes get very caught up in titles and in that kind of thing. And I think it's incredibly important to remember what your purpose is, to remember why you are there. Every time I was making a decision whether to do something or not do something, I always asked myself, how does this benefit my community? And is this benefiting my community? And that is how I always stayed grounded in how I responded. And the second thing is to show up. If you want to rebuild trust in your community, the best way to do that is to continue to show up for your community. And I showed up in various places. Sometimes I got screamed at. Sometimes I just got hugs and people were just crying on my shoulder. But when people go through a mass tragedy or any kind of a crisis, they need to know that there's someone there who's also human. I was never afraid of crying myself. I remember in one meeting I cried and somebody said, "Oh, you shouldn't feel badly about that." And I said, "I don't feel badly about that. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not human." And I think people appreciate knowing that, you know, that someone's there to listen. Someone's there to hear the pain, and someone's there to work with them toward the solution. I think those are important things that I've learned, and that I think are important lessons in crisis or not in crisis.
And those are great lessons. Rachel, did we have any questions or comments from the audience?
Nothing in the chat box yet, but Mayor Savin has her hand raised.
Okay. We can recognize her. Mayor, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, maybe some technical difficulties there. Rachel, do you see any other hands?
No, not at this time.
I think you mistook me just clapping.
Okay. I was clapping on the inside too, so I definitely understand that, Mayor. Okay. All right, Scott.
Hey, Shawanda.
Yes.
Hey, it's Scott Dudley. So I had a question for the mayor about that, and really for the previous mayor, I wanted to ask it too, because it hasn't been really talked about yet, in terms of community relations and how they came into play, what the sort of the groundwork that you laid for really all the mayors that we're going to be talking to, in terms of, you know, building those relationships ahead of time, not waiting until something tragic happens, that in order to start building those bridges out to the community. I'd like to hear their input on that a little bit.
Yeah, Scott, that's a great question, and long time no see.
Long time no see, Mayor.
Yeah, it is critical to be establishing those relationships throughout the community, whether it's with your chambers of commerce, whether it's with your League of Cities, whether it's with your neighboring cities, the commission, and also the management of those cities. School board, the more relationships and connections you have developed, the better, because you are, even my fellow mayors, I mean, there were so many people that I had to rely on because I needed help. And it was so important that I had always realized that as a city, we were never an island. As much as we would love to think everything we do in the city is under our, purview, we are so interconnected with our neighboring cities, with the county, and it's really important in our everyday work to make sure that we're establishing and maintaining and cultivating those relationships, because we're affected by decisions that get made throughout our area, not just within our city. And I came to rely on those relationships very strongly, including not just with elected officials, but also with different staff members, from the school board to the county, with Children's Services Council. It's just really important to maintain those, to start those relationships and really cultivate those relationships, because you never know when you're going to need help.
Mhm.
Yeah, let me jump in real quick, because certainly during our monument issues this summer, the cooperation, we only have 3. We have the Sheriff's Department and 2 municipalities, both with separate police departments. Beautiful cooperation and support amongst the 3 agencies. So we would use their officers on substantially every one of these protests, so whether they were on the street or were being held in reserve. And so that cooperation amongst our law enforcement was incredibly gratifying. The cooperation in our county during our hurricanes, equally gratifying, just tremendous unity, very clearly understood chains of command, very, very gratifying. COVID, however, was a completely different story. We did not have the same level of cooperation with the county in particular, and all it does is create confusion and mixed messaging. Our citizens don't know where one municipality ends and the next one starts. They don't know if they live in Parkland or they live in Broward County. They don't know, but they are looking for leadership. They're looking for a clear message. And when we as local governments are not singing from the same hymn book, all it does is create confusion and discordance for the people we're trying to serve. And so I can't underscore enough of what the representative says about the needs to build those relationships and to use them when any of these issues arise.
And if I could just add on to what the mayor just said, hurricanes, we all prepare for those. We all expect that that's going to happen. It is crisis management, but it's crisis management we expect. The issue comes in, COVID is a perfect example of crisis management we don't expect. And yet the rules should be pretty similar. The leadership should be pretty similar. We want to have clear communication. We want to have unified communication. We want to give our residents the information of tools of how they can help themselves. In the case of a hurricane, it's making their preparations. In the case of COVID, it's about maintaining the CDC guidelines. So the bare base, the structure is there. It just seems that when it's crisis we're used to, we react well and it all works. And then when it's crisis we're not used to, we kind of say, oh no, what now?
Very great.
And if I could ask, when Mayor Brudnicki speaks, if he doesn't mind addressing that question also, I'd just like to hear about laying the groundwork. We talk about in advocacy how important relationships are. And so I'd just like to, when Mayor Brudnicki has a chance to, when it's his turn, I'd like, if you don't mind, just asking him that question too. So.
I made a note, Scott. I'll make sure that if the mayor doesn't think of it, I get a chance to ask him about it. So thank you, Representative Hunschofsky, and thank you, Mayor Upchurch, for joining back in on that conversation. We've been talking, of course, about the challenges that our cities can face because of choices that human beings make as a primary driving force. We're going to turn now to talking about the one we know all of us know it can come at some point, but perhaps we're not even knowing that fully prepared for what it can look like, the perennial threat of major storm events. And so I'm bringing Mayor Brudnicki into the conversation. Mayor, Hurricane Michael came ashore in early October of 2018 and hit Panama City among some of our other cities. You told me that you have historically ridden out the storms and that you rode out Michael as well in the city. But this was a very different ride out experience from anything else you'd had. And maybe it would be helpful to start by just describing a little bit about what it was like to ride it out and what you found when the storm cleared, just personally in terms of your own home.
Yeah, it was something that we had never experienced before in this particular area. I've lived here since 1965, and I just turned 65 years old. So in 50 years of living here, we've had a lot of minor storms. We've had some that did cause some damage at the beach mostly. But this particular storm was, you could not have been totally prepared for the type of storm that we had. 2 days beforehand, it was a Category 2, and we knew something was coming ashore, and just within a 48-hour period, it turned into a 5. And it turned into a 40-mile swath of tornado. We had something just east of St. Joe, which is about 35 miles from here, go all the way through and hit the east end of our beach. That 40-mile swath, it looked like the Jolly Green Giant came through and just kicked everything down. It was amazing, the microbursts that we had, and the amount of debris and destruction was just devastating.
Even getting out of your own home to go and start leading the recovery, if I remember correctly, you couldn't even get out your front door.
No, I couldn't even get out my front door. Just the amount of debris. I mean, we got trees that are over 100 years old that had never been knocked down before. The amount of debris, put it in perspective, Hurricane Irma, over 50 counties had 2.5 million cubic yards of debris. Our particular storm in this 35 square miles of the city of Panama City had almost 4 million cubic yards. So we had that much more than they had spread over 50 counties. So what that does is it causes just this unbelievable amount of damage and trash that is in the way, and you can't do anything until you clean it up. Now, what we experienced immediately was no communications. Our Verizon, our cell phones, everything was down. We had no power, of course, and no water, and no sewer. But when you can't ask if grandma's still alive, and grandma can't ask if you are still alive, causes a tremendous amount of angst within your community. So we barely had a little bit of AT&T from some old lines that were in the ground. And as long as not more than 40 or 50 people were trying to call at the same time, you could use the phone. So you can imagine from a emergency standpoint, there was no plan put in place. Well, if you can't even have communications at your emergency management center, there was no plan to go start having, do we go to the 1-2 counties over? So, and it was a total wind event. It wasn't a water event. And the amount of devastation it was frightening, is what it was.
And so you've already given us some sense of scale in terms of just like the debris piece of that. And of course, that immediately goes to literally the bottom line. You have to come up with a way to get all that stuff out of there. You can't do anything until you've cleared the roads and gotten that stuff away. Talk to us a little bit about the cost just of the debris piece of it and how that relates to what your normal year looks like in terms of your budget.
Sure. Well, even before that, though, I want to understand that until the roads are cleared, we have 2 hospitals that we've got to farm out hundreds of patients. We filled up every hospital all the way to Mobile, which is 150 miles away. We have thousands of nursing home patients that have to be taken out.
Yeah.
So you've got roads that have got to be cleaned out. You've got patients that have got to be taken out. I mean, it sounded like a war zone. There's ambulances running 24/7. And the state is providing all these extra ambulances coming to town to be able to take these people out. So just, you can only imagine how it was a commonplace thing to hear ambulances running constantly and not being able to try to get a hold of, oh, do you have any beds available? Wait a minute, we don't even have a damn phone to be able to call somebody to find out. So we had 2 MASH units that were set up at each particular hospital, but it was just like a war zone. I mean, there was no doubt. I hired a 2-star general to be our city manager 2 weeks before the storm. And although I have never served during wartime, I was just barely after the Vietnam era. I asked him if that's what our city looked like, because he was part of rebuilding Baghdad. And he said, yes, some of this looks worse. So from a cost standpoint, we've got about a little over $100 million budget in the city, including our enterprise funds. Our debris and emergency management expenses, category A and B, were $140 million. We had a $20 million reserve for our city, and we burned through that just like that. So we had the financial wherewithal to be able to go to the bank, to be able to borrow money, because you can't fix up until you can clean up. And you can't clean up if you can't pay your debris bill. So we had to, it took months and months of doing all of this. One of the things I can tell all my constituents out there is document, document, document. You need to make sure you document all the volunteer hours and materials that are brought into your community, because you can use this to help offset the amount of money that you will not get from FEMA. You know, you can be a 75-25 storm or a 90-10. Now, our emergency expenses and stuff for the first 45 days is reimbursed by FEMA 100%. But everything after that, you've got this window of money that you are not going to get repaid for. And you want to keep as little of that as possible off the backs of your constituents. So you document all those hours and you get full credit for all that.
So you're starting to organize to do the response. Your city hall actually, when Michael hit, was under construction, right? I mean, it wasn't even, it was already being worked on before the storm hit. So you're staging your recovery efforts, how and where, and you've already talked about communication. How did you do that with your employees? How did you do that with your residents?
We were in a Verizon tent for weeks because there was no place to have city hall. And that's the way all of our constituents around us, the cities that got hammered, basically had to do the same thing. You operate a tent. There is nothing else. And thank the good Lord that we had, most of our beach was not severely damaged. When I say beach, Panama City Beach had places for residents to be able to go live, because most of the houses in town were inoperative. And still, I guess right now we're probably 60% built back after 2 years. But so we had all kinds of people. We had hundreds of our city employees that we needed to be at work, that we housed out there at the beach and paid for them to have a place to live, because they had to come to work. We had to, it was business as usual, even though it was very unusual. And you still have to have your people. So just something you just could never imagine, the number of things that come up that you would never expect to come up, even with a storm like that. So once we had communication reestablished, once we had power on in many areas, we were able to act, have some sense of normalcy. But for weeks, for a couple of weeks, the only communication that we had here in town I would go to the one radio station that was working and would get on there and tell people things. And it was kind of like, that's the only thing they could hear. People were walking around like zombies. It was really amazing.
A very practical thing that when you and I talked about this beforehand, that it had never crossed my mind, but I think is a really important, again, very practical takeaway as mayors think about having to deal with something like this. You talked about the importance of a declared state of emergency in a way I had never thought about, having to do with the vultures that come into town right on the heels of the storm winds clearing away. Just so for the benefit of everyone here, why is a state of emergency, a declared state of emergency, so important, and how does it help protect your community against the vultures who exploit people suffering?
It's amazing how many, I guess vultures is a nice way to put it, that show up in your community after one of these events. You've got contractors that come in unlicensed. People are very vulnerable. For example, go to someone's house and I need a tarp put over my roof. So they'll charge them, well, it's easy. They'll charge them $3,000 to put a $75 tarp up and about $200 worth of work and tell them, your insurance is going to cover it. Don't worry about it. Well, they don't tell them that when your insurance policy gets ready to pay and you've got 20 grand insurance on your roof, 3 grand of it's already been peed away because you gave it to this doofus who put a tarp on there that probably didn't even stay. So a state of emergency does a couple of things. When you have these people that come to town, a state of emergency, it's a 3rd-degree felony. So you take these people and you put them in jail. Otherwise, it's a $1,000 fine and they go back to work. So, and they can go back and do it again. So we are still in a state of emergency today that we redeclare every 2 weeks. We have a commission meeting, just like we do for COVID-19. And it's also, you want to do that because you want to make sure that you get reimbursed if there's any funds available from FEMA during this time or anything else. You want to keep that state of emergency going. And all it does is help protect you and protect your citizens. So it's very important.
Mayor, one of the things that I think you said that was critical to Panama City's recovery was the way that the community came together. And Scott Dudley asked that when you speak, you elaborate on that further. Can you talk about the relationship and resilience of your residents and staff?
Absolutely.
And Mayor, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. For some reason, your camera flipped.
Mm-hmm.
So we can still see you and hear you, but you're sitting on your ceiling. So you might, I don't know if there's a quick way to fix that. Otherwise, it might be best just to turn the video off and we'll just listen to you.
Okay, hold on.
It's a little disorienting.
Sorry.
That's all right. Obviously, that's a technology thing, not a your thing, but there you go.
I thought it was just my computer.
No, I think all this conversation about how topsy-turvy things come with a storm may have produced a computer response. But thank you, Mayor. You're right back the way you were.
I always sit like that. I just anyway, going back to the resiliency, I understand that all the schools were blown up. Normally, we have schools that's where people go as our places of shelter. Those are the most sturdy buildings for people that are living in trailers or living in something that's less able to withstand the wind. And so most of our schools got blown up. So people, the resilience of our people was tested like no other time that we've ever had anything happen here. And the communication and cooperation between the cities, we brought in comfort stations to provide people a place to charge their phone once we finally were able to use phones, to be able to get something to eat, something to drink. And we had people coming from, there's 5 cities within the county, and people were coming from all those cities to our comfort stations. And there was no lines of demarcation between all the different areas. So people were, the communication level that we had with the county and all the rest of the people was wonderful. And everybody was helping everybody out. And thank God the beach was available for us to be able to have people go out there and live, and had some very good communication with everybody out there to make sure that things got done. It was almost like we were all on the same council, okay? And I mean, that's what you got to have. And so we still have that same relationship. We have our commission meetings in our county building every single month. And so the degree of communication between us all is very good, continues to be good. And the citizens benefit from that. Anytime you've got controversy, that costs time and money, and the citizens are the ones that pay for that indirectly. So ours is very strong.
All right, Mayor Upchurch, I'm getting ready to bring you back into the conversation, but first we have a question from Mayor Ann Gerwig. Feel free to unmute yourself.
My question is for Mayor Brudnicki. I was president of Palm Beach County League of Cities. I think it was a day after Michael hit your town. And in South Florida, we get pretty used to these kinds of, events, and everyone just wanted to help. And I was frustrated because someone wanted to send 100 tarps and another city wanted to send brooms and, and cleaning supplies. And I was kind of stuck because I said, I don't want to send, I don't know where we send them. I don't know if there's anyone there to receive them. Let's get our emergency operations people together. What's the best thing for us to do here locally when something happens far enough away? What's the best way for us to be able to help?
I think at that particular time, because communications were so bad, it's best to try to get a hold of the mayor in the particular town. That's what I did in the last, in Sally's, in this last storms that we had over in New Orleans and the parishes over there. I called the mayor of St. Charles and found out where is the best place that we could deliver something where it can get distributed, because sometimes things sit on a truck because they don't, it doesn't happen. So that's what I did, and I guess that probably the best thing to do would be able to get a hold of the mayor and or the county manager or city manager of one of those particular cities, and we could we directed people when they called us of where to take that stuff to. But that was a problem because we would get trucks. We filled up trucks to take to the west of us for those, to help people out, and then we didn't know where the hell to take them to. So it's difficult. We want to make sure that it gets in the right hands and it gets distributed.
Thank you, Mayor Brudnicki. So I want to bring Mayor Upchurch back into the conversation. You previously began discussing the long-term challenges that we're facing in Florida when it comes to storm events, specifically both in planning and complacency and the interactions between municipalities and the county. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, I'm humbled by hearing what happened in Panama City, and fortunately, our community has had nothing like that. But we did have a significant impact from both Hurricane Matthew and 11 months later from Hurricane Irma. We dodged a little bit of a bullet with Dorian, but we had 3 hurricane events in 4 years, and probably similar to your communities. A large portion, our city's unique in 2 particular ways. Of course, part of it is our historic resources. So we have structures from the 1st and 2nd Spanish period. We have Gilded Age structures, all of which are very, very susceptible to flooding. I mean, just yesterday, I don't even know what yesterday was other than we had a little bit of wind, but we had a significant amount of water in the street. And so we've got these vulnerable historic structures, and then a significant portion of our residential area is a dredge and fill subdivision from the 1920s. And so at a very low elevation. And so we deal on a regular, even a monthly basis with street level flooding, with any type of high tide coupled with a full moon. And then you throw in a nor'easter or any other type of weather event, and we've got certainly water in the streets. We have certain homes, and we almost know, I mean, we do know them, that are getting water intrusion, particularly into garages, occasionally into the house itself. And so, these are, and then of course, coupled with the fear of any type of tropical storm and hurricane and the impact that that would have with our flooding issues. So we have spent, and again, much of this predates my return to the commission, but all sorts of time, effort, and money trying to address stormwater, seasonal monthly flooding issues. And it's very, very important to our citizens, as you can imagine. They're hypersensitive to it. They're getting pretty savvy with those issues. So we've taken a number of different approaches.
Yeah. So now we want to open up the floor for questions for all our panelists. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat now.
Currently, we don't have any questions in the chat box.
I just saw one hand go up, so I'm going to ask her to unmute. Christine, go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you to all the speakers. Obviously, I'm the mayor of Ocean Ridge, and we're a tiny little bedroom oceanfront community in South Florida. So some of the issues that you were dealing with, luckily, we have no commercial. We only have 1,700 households, so we don't have to deal with, hopefully, some of the issues that were from the initial speakings. But it was very interesting. I have a question for the last speaker. Obviously, because we are surrounded by water and actually we've got islands on islands, so we're even more susceptible in some ways. But how are you dealing with some of this flooding? We've got water intrusion from the ground up. We can't put any more outfalls into the intercoastal, and probably rightfully so because of DEP. And the intercoastal is so full that it's breaching all our seawalls anyways. So, I mean, what are some of the things that you're actually, boots on the ground doing to help with some of this, this flooding and, standing water problems?
Probably one of the most impactful things we have done is to create and install one-way valves on our stormwater outfalls into the intercoastal. So of course, at a high tide, traditionally that water was coming back through the stormwater system. That has been very, very helpful. We are looking at our building codes to going forward. The proposal, we've just started this, the proposal may well be that we do not build on slab anymore, that we require more of a pier construction, not necessarily pilings, but piers, in order not to disrupt the natural hydraulics of the land. What we have experienced since Matthew, when we've had a number of homes either rebuilt, torn down and vacant lots, and now they're beginning to be built, is that people are coming in and raising the elevation of their lots to 9 feet. Great for them, not so great for their neighbors. And of course, it can impact the natural hydrology of how water flows. And so we're looking at that very seriously. We have raised critical infrastructure, particularly sewer lift stations, to make sure that they are above at least 7 feet is what we're working on for a lot of this. We have actually done things as simple as earthen berms along the intercoastal. So not all of it is high dollar ticket. We do have a multi-million dollar, I think the price tag is almost close to 100 million to address one particular area of town. But we have 3 strategies. You defend, you adapt, you retreat. And the city employs some of those, but individual citizens are employing those as well. They're making decisions to relocate. One of the blessings we have is we have a very vibrant real estate market. And so that has been very helpful for us.
All right, Mayor Hazel Rogers, I saw that you had your hand raised. So before we bring in Mayor Hill to help us tie all these themes together from our great panel today, I'm going to invite you to unmute and ask your question.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I came in with Mayor Christine Hunschofsky, my sister mayor from Broward County, now state rep, the end of her presentation. And I heard communication was one of the questions asked of her. How did she deal with communicating and the responses that she got and how she engaged her community? And I started thinking about COVID-19 and how we communicate, right? In our communities, knowing that our governor sets the standard as to whether or not we are working from home. Now there's a new hybrid of communications wherein some members can be home and some members must be at City Hall. And I am saying, and I'm wondering, I have planning and zoning boards that are citizens who volunteer to be on those boards. Now they are being told that they have to be like the commissioners who are elected, that they must come into City Hall to be able to communicate, to be able to move our city forward. So I'm saying communication during a crisis like this pandemic that we have compared to a hurricane, you know, FPNL and all those other utility companies, if it's down, but you can still go into City Hall and you can still see each other and have a conversation. So I'm saying conversation is different when it's mandated by different level of government down to us locally. And now we are seeing a crisis that is a problem that we're not able to communicate because the private sector, the private citizen does not want to come to City Hall. So my planning and zoning board cannot function. So I don't know, there's different level during a crisis. This is a major crisis and our citizens aren't willing to put themselves at risk like we do as elected officials. Any of my colleagues are experiencing resident citizens not wanting to come into City Hall. They want to be safe.
We actually have had something of a different experience. My other four commissioners are very reluctant to return to in-person meetings. We have been on Zoom since the first time it was authorized way back when, I guess in March. I made the decision personally to return to the commission meeting. It's much easier for me to conduct the meeting, to support our law enforcement who are present at our meetings when I'm physically there to support our clerks and staff. The only thing I can tell you is an open phone line was an absolute disaster for us. It turned into talk radio and we could not monitor. We did not know how many people were on the line, nor did we have any way of judging if they were calling multiple times. And after our COVID meeting, our special meeting to adopt a mask ordinance, it was the worst, and I've done this for 30 years in various capacities. It was the worst public meeting I ever have attended. And so we removed the open phone line from our repertoire. But my sense is our community has responded to the other alternatives, and but I'm anxious for us all to be back face to face.
If I could just add on to that, it's been very challenging because everybody, again, is coming at this pandemic also from a different life experience and a different perspective. Some people have members at home who have vulnerabilities, and other people have already have the antibody, so they're good to go. And everything in between. So it's once again that idea of one would want to be communicating and having as many options as possible, and also that the communication would be unified and concrete. We personally experienced in Parkland when we were allowed to have the virtual meetings. We did the Zoom meetings, and we actually had higher attendance from the public because it was so much easier for them to just jump on the computer and participate in the meeting through Zoom. So that was interesting. And I think actually something that was very positive about the Zoom meetings is that it really did make the meetings in many ways more accessible to people with their busy schedules who maybe just wanted to jump in or out for a certain agenda item.
Can I ask, can someone just tell me, now that we are under a mandate to have our commission meeting going back into the buildings, and if we have certain boards that are under the sunshine rules and should be following the same guidelines, communications guidelines, as mandated by our governor and our county, that we are in the commission chambers, and some of your members can be operating from home because only 5, it's 5 of us, 3 present at the commission meeting, the other 2 can be operating from home. No, you have that private sector, those committees, and they are not willing. So my planning and zoning board cannot function because none of my members on those boards are willing to come into City Hall. That is the challenge we are having. I'm wondering if any other city is having that challenge. Your residents are all willing to just come back to City Hall and act like there's no COVID, even when it's worse than 3 months ago?
Well, I can tell you from Panama City standpoint, people here were upset when we closed City Hall.
Okay.
It's just exactly the opposite situation. And, people are masking up. We take temperatures before people go into the building and just operating just like when you would go into Walmart or going to the grocery store. But none of our committees are not wanting to meet. We just haven't experienced that. Which I guess is good. Because I don't know how you can make any progress if you're planning, people can't meet. The people that want to get something done got to be outraged if they can't get a decision. So development order gets done and stuff like that, but we haven't experienced that.
I'll add, I suppose, for the standpoint of these being, appointed committees, that if people are not willing to do what is required to serve on the committee, that's an opportunity to say, we need you to do this. If you can't, please step down, or for the council or commission to remove them and appoint them. They are appointed, I presume, by your council or your commission. And sometimes I know in my own experience on council, there were members of some of our citizens committees who kind of thought that was their entitlement, and it's not. It's a service position. And so if they're not willing to serve, I can understand that, but maybe we just need to invite them to think about some other way to serve the community at this point. Thank you for the question, Mayor. Shwanda, I think you have something you wanted to offer up to Mayor Hill. Yeah,
we're going to invite Mayor Hill to come back into the conversation and just to, talk a little bit about how all of the panelists come together and what the common thread is amongst these candid conversations.
Okay, just before I come back in, Mayor McDonald's had his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Mayor McDonald.
Yeah, I can't find the raise hands thing on my iPad. So I'm just getting very comfortable. I wanted to address a couple of different things, and Scott and I have talked about it in the past in a broader view, pre-COVID times. What we've done in Maitland, this is about a city of about 25,000 or so, and we're very blessed and to be immaculately well located. But the point is that in terms of, golly, so much to talk about. Being able to have, volunteer advisory staff meet. Now, we're fortunate in that our council chambers are large enough that we can accommodate putting up plexiglass shields along the dais on everybody's spot. So there's room for everybody to sit. And it's a magnificent pain in the ass because you're looking at glare from plexiglass to look down the dais at your folks. It's a pain. I don't hear well. I can't see well. And so, but it's safer. Now, in addition to that, we can accommodate socially distanced 6 feet apart, 28 members of the public in the chamber. That's in addition to our staff and police and so forth and all that. So we've been able to accommodate that. And much to Scott's point, if it volunteer advisory people, or in this case now, with our own council members, if you don't want to show up, we'll find somebody that will. So we'll miss you. And we have rules in place that if you miss a certain number of meetings, adios. So it's very clear. Earlier, getting back to what we were talking about, Christine was talking about in Parkland, the communication issues. We've made a concerted effort. Okay, maybe I've made a concerted effort. The city of Maitland speaks with one voice, period. And it's not mine, although I would love it to be, but it's not. So we have a public information officer that's very smooth, very good, knows his stuff. And he does, it could be a she, which would be even probably better. But he does all the communications to media outlets, to anybody that we need to speak to. That's the one voice that people hear and see, and they can trust because they know that they can reach him. What else had come up? I wish I'd been elected king and not mayor, but that didn't work either. I'd take a pay cut for that. But no, these are very valuable things. We can find a way when people want to serve and are committed to serve, they'll find a way into the room. And if they aren't the folks that are comfortable with it, because we have a couple of council people that are very uncomfortable with that. But that's not what their oath of office, expected of them. And that's not what the stewardship of leading the city of Maitland includes. So sometimes you just got to stand up. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. We have one more question from Robert Apgar, and then we will turn it over to Mary Hill to close out.
If my hand was up, it's by inadvertence. So I apologize.
No problem, Mayor.
All right.
Okay. And so, again, I think the conversation was wonderful today. I definitely want to thank all three of our panelists for taking time out and of their busy schedules to share with us some of their experiences and what are really travesties that have taken place throughout our state. I think the overwhelming question that's out there, and it's one that we really didn't get into a lot. We talked a little bit about it, we touched on it, but it's my last question for the panelists. And that's simply the aftermath is probably the worst part of all of these experiences. And in the aftermath, what did you do to regain confidence, to regain hope, and to reunify your communities? Were there any special efforts made by you as mayors at that time to really start to galvanize the community once again throughout the healing process? Because the one thing we know is while many folks will listen to the PIO, they want to hear what the mayor has to say. They don't care whether you're a strong mayor or a weak mayor. That system is out the window. What they care about is what their mayor thinks and how the mayor is going to make things better for the community. And so if anyone wants to tackle that question, go right ahead.
Well, I guess I'll start. One of the things that happened with us after any storm, every 6 days, your tragedy gets supplanted by something else all over the United States, and you get forgotten about. There's a flood somewhere else, there's an earthquake, there's something that happens somewhere else that takes the focus off of your area. And so one of the things that you've got to do that we did was to make sure that we spent the time continuing to beat the drum in Washington for our FEMA money, for all the things that we needed to do and keep things going, clean up as soon as possible, and show some type of progress every day. You can say all kinds of things, but actions are what people respond to the most. And so we never stopped working, making sure that people knew. And I was out there just like the rest of our council was out there, and our city manager was out there, and our employees were out there shining. And you set the example. When you set the example for everyone else, their resiliency will continue to show. I mean, our kids being put out of school and not having any place to go to school for so long. So you never stop working. And even though other people won't forget about you because they're worried about the fires in California rather than what happened here, you have to keep beating the drum. And that's the way that you keep confidence in the public, is to never stop working.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, in our case, it was very difficult because there was a whole mental health component, a PTSD. I mean, we have some students who never returned to school, and we're 2.5 years later. It was a dual role. The one rule that the mayor was just talking about was literally up in DC to get money to help pay for the law enforcement response, because there's no way our city had that in the budget. Going in front of the school board to make sure we had increased funding for additional SROs that we needed. Being up in Tallahassee, I mean, we were very lucky that session was still in place so that we could make an effort to get funding for safer schools, mental health, additional guidance counselors, and all those services that we needed, where there would not be any type of resilience without that, especially that mental health funding. From a public standpoint, it all goes back to showing up everywhere in your community. When a tragedy happens, people start to lose faith and trust in government. They start to lose faith and trust in the institutions that are supposed to keep them safe and be there for them in their time of need. And so it's very important to be out there in the community listening to what the needs are, because there's no way you can fulfill the needs if you don't actually know what the residents' needs are. And being out there and letting them know. I communicated regularly on social media. Our city communicated regularly. Also telling people to be kind to one another, take a breath, that this is a long-term thing that we're going to have to work through, and that everybody is going to have to show patience with each other. And also empowering residents by letting them know the resources that are available to them, so that they can also get the help they need.
You know, my experience was very different because, as I said, on the Confederate monument, I took a leadership position, and therefore I became a lightning rod of opposition. My wife and I's home was picketed twice. And so really with the strong recommendation of the city police chief, I took a very quiet role after we made the decision. If I were to appear at any of these events, it would have only made their job infinitely more complicated. And we also encouraged those groups that were supportive of our decision to stay quiet and stay out of the way, because again, it makes law enforcement's job infinitely more complicated when you have competing protests. And so we kind of went into a quiet phase and certainly communicated on the plans and the progress of the relocation. But we have now had probably 6 weeks of no public comment about the issue at our commission meetings. The mail is almost non-existent. We've gotten through an election. And so I think in some ways the decision is filtering down the list of concerns. Now I think we're just so excited to get back to the ordinary business of running a city. I mean, how nice to have a zoning appeal. How nice to, you know, do kind of the nuts and bolts things that we've not been able to do for so long because of monuments and COVID. And continue to be positive, look for candidly some feel-good things we can do in our community. We started our Nights of Lights early, partly to support our business community, but partly to move our community into the holiday season and just kind of march forward. But anyway, it's hard. You don't like having to take that low profile, but it was the right thing for us to do in the city.
Kind of a testament that the grass is greener on the other side.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think overall what we're seeing is that the candor, the presence of the mayors in these situations. And I think the one thing that we got from Hunschofsky is that mayors are human, and that in these tragic situations, in these situations of controversy, we have to make sure that we don't forget that we're not machines. It's okay for us as we begin to heal communities, that we show human factors. It's okay for us to show emotions, but I think more than anything, it's okay for us to have a network of individuals who go through the same things on a regular basis, like the folks who are assembled here on Zoom, who can actually help you through when there's an opportunity to do so. And I think all too many times we don't use our help button or we don't phone a friend. And this is the perfect opportunity for us to do that. And I think that these candid conversations, and always everyone on this call has had to deal with at least one or two of these situations in the present time. And so as we deal with the pandemic, and we find ourselves in situations where something that you would think would be very simple in Parkland, as the entire community wanting to protect our children, how it becomes politicized, and all of a sudden there's a group that wants the Guardian program, and there's another group that wants no guns in the community. But overall, we all want the same ultimate result, which is for our children to be protected. And how we find ourselves in the middle of that condition, having to pull ourselves to try to keep both sides, to stay focused on what the ultimate goal is. And I think that mayors are in a very unique position, because when it all comes out, they look to us for guidance, they look to us for leadership, and they don't care about the bureaucracy anymore. They just want to know that the person who was elected to lead the community is standing there to provide common sense more than anything else. And so we thank the panelists for their work today. We definitely thank Scott and Shawanda for the work that they've done as well, and everyone in the background who has helped us out. And we're truly excited about these candid conversations and opportunities for us to form greater alliances within the Florida League of Mayors as a whole. And so I just thank you, and I'll turn this back over to Scott and Shawanda for our closeout.
And Mayor Hill, thank you. You've done an excellent job of closing us out and pulling things together. And I really appreciate the inspiration for these candid conversations. Both of these programs, I think, have been very helpful. Certainly, I felt like I've learned from our guests. Let me explicitly thank Mayor Upchurch from St. Augustine, Representative Hunschofsky, formerly Mayor of Parkland, and Mayor Brudnicki from Panama City. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Thank you to all of you in our audience, and there will be another candid conversation. Keep your eyes open, and in the meantime, hope everybody has a safe and joyful time of holidays and getting back to normal, like zoning appeals, as Mayor Upchurch said. Take care, everyone.
All right.